Well, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. Welcome to my webinar, The Right Approach to Pre-Job Costing. Thank you all for being here. I know this is probably one of the drier topics I speak about, but I'll do my best to make it interesting because it is certainly vital to the health and success of our organizations. I want to give you a few reminders before we get going that you can post questions at any time. Please use the question box, the Q&A box. Those are on top of my screen. I can see them. I don't always see the chat box though, but you can drop some chats in there if you care to. This is recorded. It will be archived. You'll be able to find it on avmatters.com through your login on there, or it'll also be posted on trstimson.com. AV Matters will have the handout. We'll have a copy of the slides for you. So you may want to check on it there. So where do I, how do I start all of this? There's job costing and there's pre-job costing. And technically, if you're looking at cost before a job, it's not really job cost. This is semantics. It's taking a look at the value of something to decide whether or not you're going to do it. Oh yeah, I'm still me. My apologies. I haven't even talked about our sponsors. You know what? I'm probably more excited about pre-job costing than anybody else. But let me pause here. We have some great sponsors for AV Matters. They make this possible. Without them, I couldn't afford my assistants. I couldn't pay all the GoToWebinar or Zoom fees and everything. And it wouldn't be as much fun to do all of this without their support. So Nationwide Video, AV Stummful USA, Flex Rentals, Digital Projection, Complete Crewing, DWP Rents. They're great folks. Please check them out. Please patronize these people. They are helping make sure that the content that I bring to you is free and easy to get hold of. So thank you, everyone. This is part of a webinar series. This is the third one of the year. When you signed up for all of them, so they should already be on your calendar. But if you want to get other people to join you, encourage them to go ahead and register. There's a rhyme and a reason for the subjects and how they're put together. So if you're joining us in the middle of the year, you might want to go back to brand building and ideation and listen to each one of these. And then we're going to get into the complete small business. We're going to talk about the marketplace. In other words, we're going to take our crystal balls out, look at 2018. And then at the end of the year, we're going to talk about how do you review your numbers? What do I see in people's numbers? We'll do some of that end of the year finance stuff. All of these tie together, and they're all part of the Intentional Success Program. And how do you make your business succeed on purpose instead of accidentally? So now let's get to this pre-job costing thing. Before you sell something to the customer, you have to sell your company. That's marketing. We need to do the branding and the marketing, the business development things in order to create value so that you are worth more than the sum of the parts in your proposal. However, the job that you're proposing on still has to be worth something, and you need to understand what that job is actually worth, not just to you, but to the customer. There's a what is the customer willing to spend and what am I willing to do it for? And if those two lines cross, we can probably make a deal. But not all jobs are worth the same to you and to the customers. And what we're going to talk about a lot today is when the job occurs, the time frame, the timing of jobs dramatically changes the value to you as the seller. Now, they may also change the value to the buyer. So we'll consider some of those things in determining what the overall worth is. What happens to me back when I was a manager, when I was managing salespeople, and now as a consultant, is people hand me proposals or send me proposals and say, look at my proposal. And I say, well, great, what's your question? And they'll say, well, is my discount too high or too low? Is my price too high or too low? What's my competitor going to do? And oh, by the way, I don't want to look cheap. I want to look really valuable. Well, these are great questions. Okay, we need to answer these questions, but they're also what I call how long is a piece of string questions. In other words, There is no right answer without a lot more information. So we're going to look at a little bit of what that information is. The questions I'm going to ask back are, what are the resources that you're proposing worth to you as the seller? And I will say that for 80% of the folks that I work with, early on, they don't have an answer to this. They have a feeling about what their resources are worth. They have a feeling about what the job is worth, but it's not based on anything other than an emotional attachment to some sort of pricing paradigm that's come to them through whatever means. The next question is, what's the outcome worth to the buyer? And as I opened up with is, this has got to be worth something to the person you're selling it to. And if it's worth more to them than it is to you, then you can probably make a deal. And if we haven't asked the right questions, if we haven't listened carefully to our buyers, we may not know what the intersect is. And we may waste a lot of time and energy trying to chase business that we can't win, or we could leave money on the table in the process. So the skills to overcome the gap between what's the outcome worth to the buyer and what's the outcome worth to you. If it's worth $100 to you and it's worth $80 to the buyer, and you actually need to sell it at $120, you've got a $40 gap to overcome. Do you have the skills to overcome that gap? And I'll talk a little bit later in the webinar about how to acquire some of those skills and how to develop some of the talents that you already have for closing this gap and moving past it into the profit zone. But we've got to apply those skills, and these are your sales skills. These are the marketing skills, the ones that you use to create value for the business. And that's not what I'm going to talk about today, but I want to remind you that this is an important issue that is out there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the math and the mindset of looking at job cost before you've done the job. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to learn how to evaluate the financial impact of your next proposal. All right. This is not about post-job costing. Everybody on this call knows how to look back on a job, add up all the expenses, subtract it from the revenue that came in, and figure out how much money you made on a per job basis. Whether or not that information is valuable to you is a completely different discussion. In the process of what we're going to learn today, I'm hoping to give you some of the tools that you will need to normalize how you talk about value inside the company. And one of the greatest benefits of the job cost analysis system that I use with my clients, particularly my production rental clients, is that it changes how they discuss the pricing on jobs. They really do look at things in terms of projected gross profit, as opposed to, well, we're going to have to sub-rent a projector, therefore we're not going to make any money on this job, so let's don't do it. We're going to change the way that you have conversations. And if you have a more healthy outlook and understanding of pre-job cost, then you're going to make better decisions about whether to, price or discount, or to simply walk away. And sometimes walking away is exactly what you need to do. However, I will tell you the byproduct of a better understanding of pre-job costs for most of my clients is meant they take on more jobs, because they start to understand the value of jobs that they might have previously perceived to be low margin. There's no such thing as a low margin job. There's only a job whose margin is lower than another job. All positive margin is good. Okay, how good is it for you? Well, that depends, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So here are some of the basics. I will sometimes in this webinar refer to contribution margin. And contribution margin is the net sales price minus the total variable cost. Most job costing systems don't actually calculate the total variable cost. They only calculate the direct costs and not the indirect costs. So you have direct and indirect variable costs. We want the total variable cost. And this is often a theoretical number. So contribution margin has a certain amount of theory applied to it as opposed to the hard accounting math of job costing. And if you really want to be boring, talk about true accounting job costing, because there's nothing to it. It's income minus expenses, boring, boring, boring. Contribution margin is full of possibilities because contribution margin pays for overhead. Your gross profit, whatever margin you generate, is used to pay for overhead. It's not a direct replacement for the overhead as used, because overhead isn't used, it simply exists in the job cost world. Think about that for a second. That overhead is there whether you sell this job or not. So if you can sell a job that generates gross profit, it will help pay for that overhead. A job doesn't have a share of overhead. If it had a share of overhead, that would be a direct cost or a cost of goods sold. So overhead is overhead, right? So contribution margin is very easy to calculate after the fact. It's like job cost, but it's not always a reflection of the value to your business before the fact. You're still going to have to use some management thinking in order to calculate whether or not the contribution margin that is available to you is worth your while, worth your risk. Pre-job cost, when I talk about this, is how do you predict the value of the potential contribution margin? Okay. It is never going to match your post-job costing measurements. These are two completely different things. These are apples and oranges. Okay. Some projects will offset overhead used by all projects. So if you have a high contribution margin on a particular job, it's going to pay down your overhead, and at some point in time your overhead is going to be covered for a given period, and your contribution margin then becomes profit. So once you have enough gross profit to cover your overhead, everything after that drops to the bottom line and becomes profit. So everything that you contribute, contribution margin, everything that you contribute up to the point that you've covered your overhead is getting you closer to the point of profitability. So we can't turn our nose up at potential contribution. Another basic is that profit is dynamic. The same project at different times of the year, regardless of what business that you're in, okay, will have different expected gross profits. Okay? If you're in a rental production company or division, a job in the busy season is going to be inherently more expensive for any number of reasons. You're going to have overhires, you have sub-rentals, you have capacity and logistical issues, the cost, you have to ship things from here to there that you can't recover on the sell side, versus a slow time when your costs are going to be very low. However, when you're slow, you're willing to accept a lower gross profit in order to win the job, because you also have a supply and demand dynamic. So pricing is strategic based on demand and availability. Therefore, gross profit is also strategic. For most of us, it comes down to utilization. If you're in the service business, and I'm pretty much everybody on this call is in a service business, okay, you measure the return on your resources. You look at the gross profit per employee, you look at the asset utilization of your rental inventory, you look at the number of turns on your money in a selling model, in a sales model. Your unsold resources still have to be paid for. So if you sell time, for instance, if I'm an attorney and I sell time, and if you're an attorney, apparently there's like 180 hours in a week that you can sell. Okay. If I don't sell 180 hours in my week, I know the math is wrong. If I don't sell those 180 hours, I can't sell them again. That opportunity is passed. If you don't rent a piece of equipment when it's available, you lose the opportunity to get any revenue from it at all. If you tie up too many resources at low margin, then you're assuming a lot of risk for not very much return. So there is a point at which even a positive contribution margin is not enough money to offset the risk inherent in utilizing the asset. So we want to take all of these things into consideration. All right. Now, some common mistakes before we get into the meaty part is when you start looking at how you make money, if you start looking at it differently and you start calculating the value of projects differently, you're going to find that you're going to want to sell them differently. And the biggest concern I hear is, well, my longtime customers aren't going to want to see things. They don't want to see things differently. If they find out that something's less expensive because it's a slow month, or they can leverage, my lack of busyness against me, they're going to expect that all the time. Well, yeah, and you'd think about that, but that's a fairly unsophisticated viewpoint, and you're really underestimating your ability to service and retain your customers. So a lot of overthinking goes into, well, what will my customers do? And most of the time I find out that this is wrong. When we do actually go back to customers and we present a different pricing model, they're generally quite receptive. If you look at gross profit or contribution margin on a particular project, if you pre-job cost without the context of all the other projects that are going on at the time, or the expected busyness of the period, you're going to make some mistakes. All right, so we have to look at the macro. We have to look at the big picture in a pre-job cost scenario. Something that comes up, and I will mention trunk slammers again. For you younger folks, trunk slammers are what we used to call people who have no brick and mortar business. They're basically a virtual company. They have, they may not have any employees. They have no rent to pay. They effectively, work out of the trunk of their car. Here we are in 2017. This is no longer derogatory. We now admire these people. We admire these virtual companies who are able to do this. However, it is still difficult for some traditional brick and mortar companies to find themselves competing against folks that have no overhead and therefore don't have the same margin expectations that you do. We misunderstand the trunk slammer model, and I'm going to talk more about it, but I will say this right now. Trunk slammers get it right, and we can learn a lot from them in their pricing model. They are setting the market pace. If your overhead is getting in the way of your ability to win jobs because it drives your prices up, there's something terribly wrong with your overhead. And another common mistake is to worry about what you don't know, because there are resources to get the answers. So talk to your advisors, talk to your business advisors, and find out what it is that you don't know and figure out how to make this work. So we're going to talk about three methods. We're going to talk about a retail model, which is retail less discounts, which we're all fairly familiar with. We're going to talk about the external cost plus margin model, or the reseller model, which we should also be familiar with, but I find it's not as universal as I would hope. And then we're going to look at substitution cost plus margin, or what I call the replacement model, which is what I tend to work in. It's where I try and drive my clients, because I think it gives us the clearest understanding of the potential value of any opportunity. All of these can work to some degree, but they have their limitations. So we'll look at retail first, because it's fairly simple. So you have a retail price minus some sort of a discount. And retail pricing, in a retail model, the retail price generally comes from a third party, often your supplier. So if you sell potato chips, the potato chip company decides what the retail price is, and then you and your store are allowed to sell it at a discount, or you can sell it at retail. Okay. It's not as common in the AV industry. If you're reselling product, manufacturers aren't necessarily telling you what retail price you need to post. However, there is often a suggested retail price. Customers, however, are a little bit smarter than to buy on retail. There is also a market price less discount, which is an adjusted retail price. For instance, let's go back to the same bag of potato chips. If the retail price is $1.99, that's the suggested retail. However, in a particular market, say, Hawaii, where it costs a lot of money to get a bag of air shipped all the way over to Hawaii, the adjusted retail price might be higher. Or in a marketplace where the buying power of the consumers is not as strong, the adjusted retail price might be lower than the suggested retail. Column pricing is a variation on the above. Column pricing, when I was a remodeling contractor, one of my plethora of careers through my life, when I would go down to the lumber yard to place an order for the project I was working on, there was column pricing. So I'd say, okay, I need 2x4 studs, and I need 200 of them. And the first time I visited there, I got a column that was, because I was ordering 200 studs, that was one or two columns off of retail pricing. And then I added, 600 sheets of Epson board or plywood or something like that. And all of a sudden my column moved over a little bit. And then by the third time I came over, I was purchasing lumber way over on the 10th column. And I could tell there was at least two more columns available if I bought enough stuff. So column pricing is just a retail price that's adjusted for the amount of volume that you buy. So here's traditional retail. If I have a retail price of $1,000, regardless of where that price came from, and I discount it 25%, I sell for $750. Okay. My cost for that product in this model is, say, for instance, $500. So if I sell for $750 and it costs me $500, I make $250. I have a 33% gross profit. Okay. Whether that's a good or bad amount of gross profit is moot. You have $250 gross profit. What I like to say is, somebody hands you $750 and you only have to give them $500 back. Do you want the deal or don't you? All right. Now, the second line, same retail price, same discount, same net price, but it's a rental model, and it's a rental stock that you actually own. So a rental company would go, oh, my gross profit is $750, so I'm making 75% of $1,000, or 100% of the net price. Are you really making 100% gross profit? And you're going, well, no, logically not, because there are variable costs that go with that. Somebody had to pull it. I've got the holding costs or the carrying costs of the equipment. I have depreciation. I have rent. It costs me something, but I don't know what. Okay. In these two examples, which one is the better deal? And if your inclination is to say the one that has the higher dollar return on gross profit is certainly the better deal, except we don't know what the real costs are for the rental stock. All right. So there's some problems with the retail model. Okay, first of all, retail price is arbitrary. And in our consumer world, no one pays retail. I mean, do you pay retail? I mean, think about where you shop. I mean, do you actually go to a grocery store that promises the highest prices in the marketplace? No, you don't. So discounts or column pricing or adjusted retail pricing are expected. And in the AV industry, whether you're selling and installing product, or you're renting product or doing production rental services, discounts are what customers expect. And often our jobs are negotiated based on the discount off of the perceived retail price. So in rental, an unrealistic gross profit per job results in subrentals that trigger no bid. For instance, if I have that projector rental at $1,000 retail, I discount it to $750, and then, find out I'm going to have to subrent a projector for $500, I might go, well, I don't want to do the gig because I'm only going to make 33%, as opposed to that 75 or 100% I was going to make before. That's a bad decision. So in the retail model, you make bad per job decisions based on a pre-job cost analysis. The other thing about the retail model is it doesn't help you close more business, because your negotiating points are transactional. You're negotiating a price of something that whose value does not change to the customer. So it's difficult in the retail model to say, well, hey, my retail price in July is lower than my retail price in October. Okay, the consumer doesn't have the same expectations about pricing as you do about cost. Now, we move into the reseller model and we overcome some of these limitations, right? And the reseller model, anybody who sells product, you sell boxes, you buy the box, you add a margin to it, and you sell it. Good. That's the reseller model. Here's how it works. You have your cost and you add margin to it. Now, there's a variation on this. An unfortunate variation is cost plus markup. Markup and margin are not the same. Most of you know that, but unfortunately, I'm going to go through it again because I'm still finding large pockets of people who think it's not a big enough difference to matter. Okay. External cost only considers variable direct costs. Okay. In this model, very often the salaried services are free to a job. And what this means is, I'll use an integration company who's doing, say, a design build integration. They may throw some dollars in for the design on the job, but the fact is they have no idea what the design costs are. They look at the design costs as overhead because the designer is salaried. And they also know that they have no way of recovering that design cost from the customer, because how do you define the cost in order to add a margin to it? It's easy to define the cost on a product and add margin to it, and customers understand that. But how do you convince them that the true cost of your designer is, $300 an hour, or the true cost of the design is actually more than the cost of the hardware in the design? That's a difficult conversation to have from a reseller model. So, another quick conversation about markup. Markup is bad for you. So for those of you who understand the difference, you can tune me out for the next 90 seconds. If your cost is $100 and you mark it up 25%, you're going to sell it for $125. Agreed? You're going to make 25 bucks, which is a 20% net profit. 25% markup, 20% net margin. 50% markup, sell for 150, yield 50. I have a 33% net. If I do 100% markup, which means double the price, I only get a 50% margin. Now, if you look at your P&L, and the average P&L for a mature service company is 40% overhead, why in the world would you sell anything at 20% net? Well, if you're thinking in job costs, you're going, well, this job is not even paying for the overhead that's involved. However, that 20% net is still valuable. But I would rather have the margin. Markup is easy math. That's why we use it. At the risk of getting more hate mail, I call it sales math, okay? Because you multiply, okay? Finance math involves division. It's a little bit harder math, but it was still in the same third grade class that you learned how to do this. Margin is better for you. If you sell at a 25% margin, you will net 25%. If you sell at a 50% margin, you will net 50%. The only sticking point that I find in organizations that think in terms of markup is that they're embarrassed that they're going to have to ask their customer for more money than what the product costs. They're embarrassed to ask for 25%. And so they're trying to minimize it, and the way you minimize it is you use markup instead of margin. We need to be a lot more comfortable asking customers for money. That's the bottom line here. So the math is on here. For those of you not familiar with it, there's a detailed explanation. Get the slides in from the archive, and you can study that. Now, we're pretty good in the job cost world at looking at blended margin. So if we look back on a job and see what we sold it for, we'll determine what our yield is. And in most cases, you sell things at different margins. So very simple equipment, labor, and expense order here. I'm showing you that, okay, in this particular case, we put a 25% margin on equipment. We put a 50% margin on labor and a 50% margin on expenses. That yielded a blended 37% margin. Right? So blended margin is when you take your bottom line and go back and look at the total cost to the total sell price. Blended margin implies that we have different margins built within the proposal, which is very important. Because what I find, and particularly in integration companies, but rental production companies are also guilty of this, is that we have misplaced risk on margin. For instance, this is an example from a client. We took a sample of their business and we said, okay, if $1 million is box sales, their traditional margin on box sales was 25%, which would give them a $1.3 million revenue to $1 million worth of costs. And you can look at the chart here. So effectively what we had was their costs for everything that they sold versus everything that they took in gave them about an 18% traditional blended margin against all services. And you'll notice that they didn't charge anything for design. They considered design a value-added feature of what they do. However, their designer was costing them $250,000 a year all in. So they knew what the cost was, they just didn't know how to make any money on it. And their concern was when they tried to raise their margins overall, they were getting pushback from the clients, particularly their longtime institutional clients, which were used to looking at their pricing in one particular way. However, their margin was not tracking with their risk, because if you look at their margin on labor, it's very low. If they make a mistake on labor, and let's face it, who doesn't, they were at a huge amount of risk. They're not making enough money there to absorb a very large mistake. So in order to help them understand how they could recast their margins to make the profit track with the risk, we tried this what if. And we did a what if on box sales. I said your margin on box sales could be lower. Maybe you would sell more if you did. Your margins on installed product could be much lower because you want higher margins on labor. And accessories, oh my goodness, what a gold mine. It's a small portion of your overall sale, but it takes a lot of handling and there's a lot of risk, and it's where we make a lot of mistakes. You can afford to put a lot of margin on there because customers aren't going to notice. They're going to pay attention to the big numbers. And if you look at what I did, they end up with a what if blended margin. It's still 18%. The revenue is still the same, but the risk has been redistributed. Most of us would benefit from a healthy review of how we make margin. In 2017, if you're still thinking that your profit center is product, an integration of any kind, then you've missed 2 decades. If you think the market will not bear higher costs on labor, you have missed 2 decades. So do the exercise and look at these things. For instance, let's take the same model. So my client agreed to try some new things, and we came up with a new margin expectation. And they actually figured out that they could afford to sell at a higher margin overall. And so they put in new margin numbers, they generated new revenue, so they actually increased their revenue about 8% with their new margins. So they sold for the next year. We went back and deconstructed it to see how they did. They ended up with a 24% gross profit. But what was more exciting is they actually sold more. And here's why. On box sales, they sold more because their pricing was lower. So they got a bigger portion of the buy, and some institutional buyers could afford to buy from them. And they increased their volume. Their contribution was much higher. They churned more boxes, but most of it was a drop ship that didn't increase their overhead at all. Their margins on installed product went way down. However, it allowed them to win some bid build jobs that they were not winning before. So they added a couple $1 million worth of revenue by changing their pricing structure. So the high equipment, low labor jobs were much, much more competitive, and the high labor, low equipment jobs were much more profitable because the risk was properly placed. That's as exciting as I can make it, sorry. All right, so there's some concerns I still have about reseller models. One is it doesn't really scale well, okay? You can fuel growth with lower margins, and many companies try to do that, After the recession, a lot of companies did a lot more bid work, and a lot more offerings turned into bid build offerings. But all that did was drive margins down, and many of us would argue that the overall quality of work in the industry went down quite a bit. The reseller model is also still transactional. It's still difficult to negotiate when you're doing cost plus, because the buyers want to reverse engineer your math. And we do have a lot of savvy buyers in our industry. We trained them, so they're very good at their jobs and figuring out how we make money and trying to preserve their share of it. My biggest concern about the reseller model is it doesn't take into account the value of what you're doing. What's the value of the outcome of what you're doing? It makes it a transaction. So resellers tend to talk about the process of what they're doing instead of the end results. They still add up the parts and pieces. They talk about the how instead of the what, and they leave money on the table. You know, and an aspirin a day will help reduce the chance of heart attack in many patients, right? Aspirin is cheap. The buffered aspirin, the buffered low dose aspirin, is actually rather expensive, but it doesn't promise to take away a headache. It promises to keep you from dying. So outcomes are much more valuable than process. And again, the reseller model tends to dwell on process. So it's not my favorite. Replacement cost is my favorite. I can make any of these work. All of my clients use one form of these or the others, and I work with all of them. Replacement works the best. I talked earlier about trunk slammers, and trunk slammers are spot on correct about value. The trunk slammer model traditionally, and I say the term with a great deal of affection, is they find out what something will cost to get done and they add some margin to it. If they can do some of the labor themselves, that's money that they get to keep. In other words, it's the perfect entrepreneurial business model. Okay? They don't bother to add overhead because customers won't pay for it. So they're selling, you know, the outcome of the products. It still might be transactional, but the value is in the right place. So trunk slammers and anybody who uses this approach to selling starts with outside costs. It's not your internal costs that matter. I'll give you a quick example. I was working with a live event company who was trying to set their job cost model, and they were trying to use their internal cost of labor. Well, they were in a marketplace where their internal cost of labor was rather low. Their employees weren't particularly skilled, and so the cost was absolutely unrealistic. They were, an audio operator for a large sound system. Their internal cost was about $20 an hour, which most of you know is absolutely insane. Their external cost, if they had to hire a freelancer, was closer to $40 an hour. But because they were doing their job costs and their pricing structure based on their internal costs, they were coming up with something that was completely unprofitable if they had to outsource. Therefore, they were talking to their customers at the wrong margin points. So if you start with outside costs, you look at the cost of outsourcing the entire project and you add margin to it, and you have to assume you have no overhead. You're simply going to add in a margin that's going to be acceptable to the marketplace. You know, what's the outcome worth to the marketplace, and can I get that money and maybe just a little bit more? Now, if you have overhead, which most of you do, your services, your internal services, and the reduced risk of being a brick and mortar company who has been around for a long time and will be around for a lot longer, will set you apart from the so-called trunk slammers. So while the trunk slammer may set the wholesale market price for a project, you are going to be worth more. And the question is, how much more? How much more are you worth than the bare bones version that's available in the marketplace. And is it 5%, 10%, 20%? I don't know, but you have to determine that when you're setting the expected margins for what you do. In the systems integration world, the model for this is the contractor plus service model. And what this looks like, I've worked with a lot of uh, lighting integration companies, and in the professional lighting world, many of the leads, particularly the bid build work, actually comes from the manufacturer. And the manufacturer will get the RFP from a general contractor of some sort, and that the manufacturer will specify the products involved, provide all that information to their dealers, who then have the opportunity to go sell the job. The most profitable, consistently profitable lighting integrators I worked with used the contractor plus service model, and they would take the RFP. It came built in with their costs because they are the dealer. They know what their internal costs are for all these products that are specified by the manufacturer. So they could put a margin on that. And then they would go out to a installation contractor, an electrical contractor, and have them do a not to exceed bid on the project, which they would turn around and add margin to that and then go sell it. And because of their exclusive relationship or semi-exclusive relationship with the manufacturer, they're in a very small pool of bidders. And if the job was regional, they had a huge advantage over everybody else and could win the job at a margin that was very acceptable to them, but hard for anybody from another region to match, because this is all built on replacement cost. Now, when it came time to actually execute the job, they may or may not hire that particular contractor. They might use some resources that they had internally, in which case they would be able to keep more of the gross profit for themselves. In the rental model, unfortunately, the rental industry still works from a retail pricing model. However, we can convert this to a replacement cost model, which is what I spend a lot of time and energy doing with my clients. Here's an example of a quote where we take a retail price of the rental equipment of $10,000, $5,000 of labor, $2,500 of expenses of whatever ilk for $17,500. We discount the equipment. We get this net price of $15,000. In the replacement cost model, I look at what it would cost me to get that equipment from the marketplace. I look at what it would cost to get that labor from the marketplace and the expense from the marketplace. And that cost factor goes into my pre-job cost model that tells me that my actual cost for this job in pre-job cost is $10,000 if I go to 100% replacement, which means that my pre-job cost gross profit is $5,000. Now, depending on the time of year, that might be a wonderful gross profit. Is 33% of pre-job cost, or what I call JCA, job cost analysis profit. So that's a nice JCA profit in this model. It may not be ideal for the given time, but that's something else that you have to take into consideration. So the cost of the equipment, the company may actually make more money if they happen to own the equipment. The company may make more money if they actually have the labor on salary, if they actually own their own trucks and don't have to outsource trucking. They may make more money in reality, but they have no way of assessing the availability of those resources without limiting utilization. So if you have to look at your entire utilization pattern in order to do a quote to find out if you're going to have projectors in stock, do I have a projectionist available? Do I have a truck available? You have to go through all of those iterations to find out if you should even quote on the job. Okay, you're going to sell less jobs. It's that simple. And you're going to stop selling when you feel that utilization is reaching a limit. Right. Now, that cost factor, that yellow highlighted thing, that 40% cost factor, the question is, where does that come from? The cost factor on rental equipment is the internal cost of using an asset, and it's derived from the market cost. Typically, I use about 80% of market cost, and I'll explain what that means in just a minute, but some companies will use up to 100% of market cost. To determine what the market cost is, We look at the market. It's that simple. Market cost for you is the wholesale market to you. So if you can run a video projector in the wholesale market, if you can consistently rent it for $500, then that's going to help me determine what my retail price should be if I'm going to work from retail. So in order to work from retail, I've got to derive a retail price that's based on something other than holding my wet thumb in the air or taking the purchase price and dividing it by 10. I'm going to say it's based on the wholesale price. So I'm going to put a 50% margin on the wholesale price, which sets my retail at $1,000. Now I can discount that retail up to 40% to give me a net price of 600 and a gross profit of 100 bucks. Okay. Now that's not a great gross profit, but it shows you that you have some room in your traditional discounting structure to sell from replacement cost. I can do the same thing with labor. If a projectionist costs me $500 in general, if I can consistently hire the projectionist that I need for $500 a day, then I should probably sell them at least a 33% margin to absorb risk, higher in many markets, which means my retail price is $746, which you would probably round up to $750 because I know how you are. So that gives me a nice gross profit, 33% gross profit. Same thing with any other miscellaneous expense. If I can hire a delivery truck for $500, I should be able to sell it for, at least 25% up to a 50% margin. Make sense? So that's the classic JCA model. There's a burden model, which will sometimes come up in our conversations, and I don't endorse the burden model, but I wanted to address it because I do find a lot of companies put a burden into their proposals as an internal cost, and there's a fundamental flaw with that thinking, although it seems to make accountants happy that they're somehow covering overhead. But a job does not cover overhead. Gross profit covers overhead. So the way a burden model is they look at the share of overhead they want every dollar to absorb. So in this model, on this screen, they want 20% of every dollar to help pay for overhead. So they're going to basically add 20% to every job. And then they're going to add margin on top of that. So if you add burden and then add a reasonable margin, okay, then you're going to probably be overpriced in most marketplaces. If you add burden and don't add any margin, okay, then all you're going to get out of the job is some cash flow. Somewhere in between is where you would end up, but all you're doing is reducing the burden in order to make margin. So in other words, burden and margin are actually the same thing. You can't double dip. So you have to figure out what the margin is that's appropriate for you and know that some part of the net gross profit will contribute to the overhead. So calculating burden in advance and applying it on a per job basis in the pre-job cost model, I don't endorse. I think it's an incredibly short-sighted point of view. And go ahead, shoot off the emails now. Now, in this whole pre-job costing thing, and I know this is a lot of information coming at you very quickly, I want to talk a little bit about timing. Because what am I going to do with this pre-job cost information is I'm going to use it to determine what's an acceptable margin I can get at this particular opportunity. I have three things that primarily affect my margin expectations for any time, for any opportunity. One is seasonality. If it's slow season, you're going to expect lower margins because you're trying to increase your utilization. You have a lot of excess capacity. If it's busy season, you need higher margin. You're going to tend to increase your prices or at least increase your margin expectations because your risk goes up and you're more likely to have to outsource. Okay, supply and demand. Demand goes up and supply is static, your pricing is going to go up. Utilization. If you have higher utilization of your products, in other words, if you're consistently busy, it will allow you to ask for higher margins because the worst that could happen is someone says no, but then somebody else might say yes because demand is high. So if your resources are well tied up, you can afford to ask for higher margins, knowing that you're more than covering the replacement costs if you need to outsource. Now, the goal is always to maximize your utilization at a fair margin. In other words, you don't want to use up utilization and lower your margins in the process, which I've run into. I've run into clients that had great utilization where if they had simply lowered their utilization and increased their prices, they would have been much better off. And then there's another factor in margin expectation and that it's strategic. The right job at the right time. And I think I'm going to give you an example. So if demand and utilization are in sync, then your margins are going to be consistent, but there's nothing about our industry that ever stays in sync. If your demand is low and the utilization is high, then your margins are going to be low, but you're going to accumulate gross profit faster because you're getting the maximum utilization. So you may end up making the same amount of money as if demand were high, but your utilization was low. Okay, and in that case, your margins should be high, and you will make the same amount of money with lower utilization. Mostly, we end up in the middle with an expected blended margin of high and low demand, high and low utilization. So, for example, if a job comes to you, an opportunity comes to you, it's a busy season, you're in a busy month. However, there's this little pocket of underutilized resources, and this job fits perfectly into that little pocket. You have a real good reason, even though it's a busy time where you should expect higher utilization, higher margin, you have a real good reason to accept a lower margin and guarantee winning the job, because that is a lot of profit that's going to go straight to your bottom line. Okay. Remember, you can't replace income for unused resources. So if you get a perfect fit job and get to 100% utilization of resources, accept it at a lower margin because you have a huge amount of contribution margin that's going to help your bottom line. This is how successful companies really knock it out of the park. They know how to fit jobs in. They know how to leverage their resources and scheduling to make it work. Now, here's another example. If you're in a traditionally slow month, okay, mostly what you're going to see in a slow month is low margin work, because people who have work in slow months know that they're slow months. If you're in the association business, a lot of association meetings are in months that are traditionally slow, in the July and the August time frame in a lot of markets. And so they expect to pay a fairly favorable price to them. Okay, in a slow month, take the lower margin job because it's a positive contribution margin, and you should accept any positive contribution margin in a slow month. Not only are you covering cash flow, you're actually adding potential profit, because if you get enough low margin jobs, it will take a bad month and all of a sudden make it a good month. But first thing you have to do is cover your overhead costs. So using pre-job cost analysis on replacement costs tells us when we hit that moment of positive contribution margin. Now, some of the concerns I'll get, and there's a good time to start thinking questions and posting some questions here, is if I start selling less, if I sell at a lower price in slow months, I'm going to devalue my services, and customers are going to expect to pay the same price when we're busy, and I can't talk my way out of this, and that's a problem. Okay. First of all, your customers are smarter than that. They already are used to dynamic pricing. They already pay different rates for hotel rooms and airfare on a regular basis. They know that out-of-season fruit is more expensive than in-season fruit. Okay? They are clever enough to understand that your prices may change based on demand and availability. Okay? If you sell a job at a low margin and a better job comes along where you can make a high margin, and I've already used up my resources, woe is me, I made a bad decision. Well, no, you didn't. Learn to oversell. Take the other job. The blended margin between the two jobs now becomes the contribution. And because you're selling from replacement costs, you can afford to do it. Okay? So you need to learn how to have thoughtful conversations with the customers anytime that you change your selling model. But I'll give you some tips on what to do next. Okay? So formulate some questions. While you're doing that, I'm going to talk about one thing here real quickly. The Jumpstart Sales and Marketing Workshop is August 1st and 2nd. If you haven't registered, go to my store, trstimson.com/store. learn about it. Send me some questions about it if you'd like. This is a team event. I'm looking for marketing, business development, and sales. Most of the attendees are sending at least 2 people. Some are sending 3 people from their organizations. We're going to get your whole team on the same page. We're going to spend 25% of the time talking about marketing, 25% talking about business development, 25% talking about sales, and 25% about how to make it all work together so that you can grow your business more profitably. If you think that you're successful today because you don't bother doing marketing, it's time to rethink. Marketing is no longer optional. And go back to any of the webinars I've done this year and learn more about why that is. So check that out. I'd love to see you there. Registration closes in 2 weeks. Well, I'm not going to accept anybody after the deadline. All right. Let's talk about mindset as we're wrapping up here. In order to understand how to use pre-job costing effectively in your favor, you have to remember and realize you're not a product, you're a service. Everybody on this call is a service business. Okay? There are no product businesses left in the 21st century to speak of. Your job is to sell the end result, which is the outcome, and not the plan, which is the process. 20 years ago, we sold the plan. If your plan was better than somebody else's plan, you won the business. It doesn't work anymore. Everybody's got a good plan now. The best thing you can do is sell the end result, which is the customer's definition of a good outcome. Our salespeople need to do a better job of listening to find out what that outcome is so that we can sell to it. And you have to balance the value to you and the customer. You're not always going to agree on price, but we can certainly narrow the gap of the discussion if we have a good understanding of what the job is worth to us, which to me is what replacement cost is all about. So if you're an SI company, take a look at your margins on equipment. If you're trying to make big bucks off of equipment, you might want to look at shifting the profit to your higher value services and start capturing some of your overhead services, your value add services like design and project management. In general, I find that integrators need higher margins on labor, but they are getting better about it. There's always a high risk in estimating, so the better you are at estimating labor, the more successful you're going to be. Intellectual property, which is fairly new to integrators, but you've been doing it for years, but that's where the margins are. You have very high margins in intellectual property if you'll learn how to leverage it. That's a little bit of what the sales and marketing workshop will talk about, by the way. If you're a rental-based business, you need to look at the internal cost of your owned equipment. It's a wholesale rate, about 80% of what wholesale is to you. The company needs to sell equipment to the job, not to the customer. And you could sell the job, you can sell your owned rental equipment for lower than the wholesale rate, and the house will make the money. You give a favorable price to the job, to which you add margin on top of that. I've done webinars on that one before, so take a look at them. We want to calculate what our job cost analysis says we can afford to do the job at, so that we can figure out what a negotiable profit is. I need to know how much money I have to work with when I sit down at the table and I want to close the deal. If I got a $100,000 job and I know I've got $10,000 in negotiable profit, and the client throws down 92,000 bucks, I have the ability to say 93 and we're done. But I have to know what my numbers are. Okay. And when you discount, if you do discount, put them where the customer appreciates them. Right now, customers don't appreciate a discount off of rental equipment because everybody does that. My best clients discount the entire job because they calculate the internal cost of the job, the replacement cost of the job, determine what the negotiable margin is, and apply the discount to the entire job. Think about it. All right. I want to thank my sponsors again for making this all possible. I've got a couple questions that are popping up, but I will answer you guys by email because I think I've gone over many of these. If you want a free introductory conversation with me, pop over to my website, hit contact, schedule an appointment. I'm happy to chat with you. You're not going to waste my time. There are no dumb questions. There's just the ones that you forgot to ask. So give me a call. Let's have a little chat about anything. So I want to thank you all again for being here. It's been a pleasure talking about one of my favorite subjects, job cost analysis. I hope you got something out of it. Tell your friends, and the archive recording will be up soon. Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye.